All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the interpreter training for the Advocates for Human Rights. I'm Shanath. I'm a program assistant. I'm also the volunteer intern coordinator at the Advocates for Human Rights. And interpreting and translating is one of our biggest opportunities for volunteering with the Advocates for Human Rights. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about what we do, just to give an intro of our organization, and then we'll get started with our training. We have some great presenters today. Sarah Brennis, who is the director of the Refugee and Immigrant Program, which is the program you would be working with if you volunteer with us, was not able to be with us today, but she is our director for this program. And then we will have an overview of the asylum process, because you will be helping us with asylum seekers with our legal fellow, Courtney Gore. And then we'll get a little overview of what you're really here for, the interpreter training and how to best legal practices while you're interpreting live for clients, as well as a little bit on translating too, right? And our presenter for that is Graciela, and we will end with a little bit of logistics about how volunteering with us goes. So the Advocates for Human Rights does lots of advocacy work on the global, national, and local scales, and we have programs that include women's rights, international justice, research and advocacy, and yes, the Refugee and Immigrant Program is what we're going to learn most about today. We have a very visible program where we work with asylum seekers and match them up with volunteer attorneys so that they can do pro bono cases and help these asylum seekers with their process. And the place where you come in is to help these asylum seekers through their documents that need to be translated, help them sometimes communicate with their attorneys, go to appointments and things like that. And we'll talk about the different opportunities today. And at the end, some of you have already decided you are going to volunteer with us. Some of you are coming here to decide if you would like to. And some of you have been doing it for a long time and have never had to get a hone in on these skills. And we're just happy to have you today. So I'm going to have Courtney come up here and tell you a little bit about the asylum process and give you context for what our clients are going through.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, it's okay to talk. Thank you, Janath. I want to say thank you to each of you who are here today and echo what Janath has said. If you're deciding whether you want to come and volunteer with us, if you're deciding whether or not this is for you, just know that you make a great impact and you mean the world of a difference to an asylum seeker. My name is Courtney Gore. I'm a legal fellow, specifically an Equal Justice Works AmeriCorps legal fellow here at the Advocates for Human Rights. I work in the Refugee and Immigration Program, and primarily my job day to day, I work with unaccompanied minors seeking asylum here in the United States. They're trying to escape persecution in their home country, and they just want a better life here in the United States. And most of my clients are under the age of 15 and come to me from Central America. And I use interpreters. Ariana, she's here today. I think I've used, who else in here? I don't see anyone. Oh, have I used? No. But you help. There's a couple of interpreters here who work with clients, and my child clients love them, and they assist me in Spanish speaking and other skills. And so it means the world of a difference. I'll be before you shortly. I'm assuming that I use this thing. Do I press the green button here? Okay. All right. So we're going to cover the basics of U.S. asylum law today. And this is not a law course, so if you don't get it, do not fret. But feel free to take notes on the slides that I provided. If you did not get a handout, share with your neighbor. This is the time to build a camaraderie, a community, and say hi to the person next to you. And if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. It'll be easier, though, if we wait until the end, just because we want to get through these slides quickly. And if you have any further questions, I will be providing my email at the end. If you want a handout, that's also going to be available. So I'm going to start with this quote: "Everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution." This comes to us from Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we at the Advocates for Human Rights in the U.S., we use different areas of law. Primarily, we use 4 pillars of U.S. asylum law. That's the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the subsequent 1967 protocol. We use the Refugee Act of 1980. We use Section 208 of the Immigration National Act, specifically 8 U.S. Code 1158. And we also use Statute 8 CFR of the 208, and that's the Council for Refugee Status. So we use a lot of different areas of law, statutes, and regulations, but those are our 4 main points that we look at. Again, if you did not catch that, that's okay. We're just giving you some background. We also use case law, and in the back, if you are interested, you're a legal mind, you might want to get an understanding. I provided a list of the resources that we do use in different areas of law, and you can look up that case law in your leisure reading if you'd like to, and if that's what you're into, but regulations and things I've compiled for you all to look on based upon our clients. So those are our sources for U.S. law. So you might be asking, oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. I pressed the laser, sorry. Here you might be wondering, what is a refugee? And so we look to 5 major components that make up the elements of a refugee. First, this person is outside of the country of their nationality. There may be people who are quote unquote stateless. And that means that they do not have a country where they identify as having a nationality. That means that we group that person as, or we label that person as having where they last habitually resided. That will be considered their country of nationality. So they're outside their country of nationality. Second, they have a well-founded fear. And we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. Third, they've experienced or have a fear of experiencing persecution. Fourth, that persecution comes to them because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their social group, or their political opinion. And lastly, they're not barred, since we're talking about the United States, they're not barred from remaining or entering the United States. Okay, so you'll hear the words refugee, asylee, and asylum. And it can get a little bit confusing, but at the beginning we're going to make this distinction. A refugee and an asylee, by definition, are essentially the same person. The difference is the process by which they get here or by which they stay here. So we're going to first look at a refugee. A refugee, like those 5 components that I went through, though that person has been labeled as a refugee prior to entering the United States. So they've gone through a process, another country or someone else has looked at their case. You'll often hear of refugees enduring some type of process prior to coming to the United States, and once they arrive on our soil, they have been identified as refugees. An asylee is someone who is initiating the asylum claim after having arrived to the United States. So they get here, or these people get here by a variety of different ways. They come as students, they come as workers, and some of them come as undocumented undocumented persons. But they come here and they have not been labeled as refugees prior to coming to the United States. These people are asylees. Both refugees and asylees are seeking asylum. So that the difference is the process. Okay. So here's our definition of a refugee. We saw the visual diagram, but this is the word text, and I will not spend the time to read it because we just went through the visual aid. But if you have any questions, this is the definition, and it's codified in our United States Code as well as the Immigration National Act, which is cited at the bottom. So be sure to refer to that if you have any further questions or the visual aid doesn't really satisfy your definition. And again, remember that if it's a refugee or an asylee, it's the same person, it's just the process by which they arrived here. Okay, so one of the elements that we went through was, or that I established, was persecution. And believe it or not, given all the case law that we've listed in the back, given everything, all the pillars that I went through of U.S. law, asylum law, there is no statutory definition of persecution, which means this is a case-by-case standard. And so we've broken them up into different parts. First, you'll see that persecution includes, or can include, the infliction of death, torture, or injury to one's person or freedom. So a lot of times when we think of persecution, people often think, okay, they experience physical abuse, but oftentimes it's to their own freedoms that we sometimes don't think about, but it can be to their own freedom. However, it has to be more than just harassment and discrimination, and I don't mean to belittle anyone's experience when I put the word just, but for our standards, or for the standards of asylum officers in immigration proceedings, it has to be more than harassment or discrimination in order to warrant persecution. It can, however, be cumulative. So if there are experiences where someone has experienced over a time span repeatedly and consistently some form of harassment or discrimination on more than one or two occasions, it can be cumulative, and that can constitute persecution. Finally, there's two types of persecution that we'll go through today. The first is past persecution, and the second is well-founded fear of future persecution. Okay, so remember there are two types. Here's a definition of torture. Again, I will not read it since everyone here I know is very capable, but this is the definition of torture. We often look to that when we think of persecution for physical, mental, or any other emotional type of persecution or infliction that someone may have faced. We often refer to this definition, and that's located in Part 1, Article 1 of the Convention of Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. So you can find that in that convention there. Okay, so past persecution. This is the procedural framework that we look to when we're trying to talk about past persecution. And the key that we will establish, I know we're interpreters, you all will be interpreting for us, but we're just trying to give you a foundation of what the content you'll be working with. So our job at the Advocates is to establish if it exists that there was past persecution. Once that's established, it creates a rebuttable presumption that there is past persecution, and the government themselves can say, okay, there's been changed circumstances, or there's reasonable relocation. So for example, we'll say that we have person A, his name is Jamal, and he may be from the country of Equatorial Guinea. He's experienced past persecution by way of his government and the police officers always targeting him. He's been beat, he's been harassed for his work in a student union. And we establish that past persecution with evidence, with reports, and with his affidavits and affidavits of family. The government can then come back and say, well, there's been a regime change in Equatorial Guinea, if that so happens, or he can reasonably relocate within the country. Now, when there's a government persecutor, that's usually not the case, but if it's a person, domestic violence, if there's any kind of reasonable relocation within the country, they'll make that argument. It is then our job as the advocates to come back, shift the burden back to the government, and say that they have experienced a severe past persecution, one where which changed circumstances or reasonable relocation will not cure their persecution and will not cure their livelihood or restore their rights. And then the second, that they experience serious harm. And so that's past persecution. That's how we do it anyway. And so you'll be helping us. You can imagine that the language that we'll be using is heavy. And so I will say this is a sidebar, and I'm sure you'll get into this, but I wanted to say that you'll be dealing with things that might be a little heavy, things that may be a little triggering, and it's important that when you go in, you know that you are making a difference. And if you need to, be sure to debrief with us. We always invite that because it's important for you all to be open with us about what we're talking about. It's not always frilly, I'll say that. So be open with us. The next is future persecution. So once we establish past persecution, we've already established as lawyers that there's future persecution or rebuttable presumption of future persecution. And so the burden stays with us at that point because we have to establish for a well-founded fear of future persecution, whether we've established past persecution or whether we're saying this person is coming here and they never experience necessarily any type of infliction, but they will, we have to establish that there's a fear of persecution, reasonable possibility of persecution by way of being singled out or by pattern or practice. And we can do that by pulling up reports of country conditions, affidavits, things that have happened in their neighborhoods, families, their pueblos, wherever. If we can establish those, then we can continue to advocate for them. we can establish that they're unwilling or unable to return due to their fear and relocation is unreasonable. Okay, and then I just went through this, but if you would like to, again, this is a more laid out written form of how we establish the well-founded fear factors. We talk about the persecutor and what they're capable of doing, what they're inclined to do, that they're aware, and that the applicant possesses belief or a characteristic that the prosecutor seeks to overcome. Oh, excuse me, not prosecutor, persecutor. Two different actors. Okay, so now we're getting into government protection. This can get a little tricky because sometimes the persecutor is the actual government of a country, and other times it's an individual or an actor that is non-governmental. And so when the actor is a non-governmental actor or person, we often ask, and it's important to establish why the person didn't necessarily seek out the help of the government. Is the government ineffective? What is the reason? Have they gone to the government for help before? We have to establish that the government themselves are ineffective to assist the person with their persecution or with their well-founded fear. And here's a diagram of this. If you look to the bottom, where the government is a non-persecutor, we have to establish that they ask for help, but they refuse to request for help. If they refuse, we have to establish that there are inadequate laws and policies, that there's inadequate enforcement. And again, there's a lot of research that's involved with that. There's a lot of asking questions and getting stories from people in the community who have shared those sentiments. If the government is the persecutor, we have to, one, establish the persecuted applicant, and we have to establish, again, the pattern of practice, or practice of persecution of the protected group. So oftentimes there will be harassment, there'll be threats, sometimes they are not physical, but again, that's not enough to establish persecution. There has to be a time span of consistency, there has to be a pattern or practice. And if there's physical abuse, we have to establish evidence of that as well. Okay, so there are 5 grounds upon which we seek an asylum claim. And these people are persecuted, we've established that, but they're persecuted because they associate with one of these 5 groups. The first is they're persecuted because of their race. They're persecuted because of their religion. They're persecuted because of their nationality. They're persecuted because of their political opinion, and or they're persecuted because of a particular social group that they identify with, associate with, or participate in. Okay, so the social group or particular social group is an interesting concept, one in which, again, we can walk through quickly, but it's a group of persons here, of all of whom share a common immutable characteristic. It must be one that members of the group either cannot change or should not be required to change because it is a fundamental to their individual identities or consciousness. So it's important that this characteristic is something that's a part of them. It's a part of you. Think of all the characteristics that make you up, that you may be persecuted for, whether here or somewhere else. And if it's something that you're born with or something that you should not be required to change because it makes you you, it's a fundamental part of your being, and they're targeted for it, it's a particular social group. And you can look to this case, again, in your leisure reading. It's also in the case law materials behind you in the back. But it lays out the framework by which we establish different particular social groups. And we'll walk through an example. But some of the social groups are listed here. They include Somali clans, women who are opposed to female genital mutilation, the LGBT or GLBT groups, the women who are unable to leave an intimate relationship, union members, student union members fighting for what they believe in. All of these are particular social groups. And that's one of the 5 aspects for which we can seek and build an asylum claim. So here's an example of a social group. And again, remember that we're looking to common immutable characteristics. These are things that people shouldn't have to change or things that people cannot change. So at the bottom, you'll see the description is a married woman in Guatemala, or married women in Guatemala who were unable to leave the relationship. There are multiple characteristics that make up that woman. She's, of course, a woman. She's Guatemalan in social context, and she's in a relationship. Her relationship status is married. None of those characteristics should be changed for her not to be persecuted. Can we all agree on that? Yes. And so for that reason, we have built right here a social group. There are multiple, I'm sure, and if she experiences, for example, domestic violence, if she experiences some kind of targeting from the government based on her husband's association with another group or her association with Guatemalan married women who want to fight for more rights, this is a common immutable characteristic for which we can build an asylum claim. Okay, so now we're going to get into asylum benefits. And these are the benefits that an asylee or refugee who's seeking asylum claim, if we successfully build a claim and we are granted asylum here in the United States, these are the benefits that they receive. The first, you get, these are the legal status benefits. First, you get a green card after 1 year. Second, you receive citizenship after 6 years. The third, you get the ability to travel outside the United States, enter or re-enter, which is really exciting for a lot of our clients. Economic security, you get unrestricted employment and you get access to public benefits. And the final, which is probably the most beautiful and gratifying, I cannot wait to get to this point with my clients, but family reunification, you can apply to bring a spouse and your children to the United States. So these are the asylum benefits here for an asylum claim. Here are the bars, though, to asylum. So there, again, here are our pillars for U.S. asylum law. The first is the Refugee Convention. If an applicant, and I will also say that we'll talk about our screening process and how we do intake and how we take on our clients. But if a client has committed a war crime or a crime against humanity or a serious non-political crime, they cannot seek asylum here in the United States. They might be able to seek entry or permanent residence or anything else by way of another claim that I'm not sure of it, but according to the Refugee Convention, it bars them from seeking asylum in the United States. U.S. law, if they fail to file for asylum within 1 year. So that means if they're here in the United States and the day that they step their feet on the soil, the day that they enter, a year later, a year from that date, they don't apply for asylum, they're barred from applying for an asylum claim. And this I will say because I work with children, I know that in the United States, and it's a little unclear, but many children are not under the age of 15. If they were under the age of 15 when they entered and they were an unaccompanied minor, meaning that they entered and they did not have guardians with them, legal guardians, or if they were unaccompanied and or their parents were undocumented, they do not fall within the statutory requirement. Of course, that's still being worked out, but right now, as children, they don't always abide by that 1 year standard, but it's important to get it in. I mean, not that I'll have interpreters do any filing, but just wanted to clarify that, but it's still being made clear. Okay, so if they are here are the different bars. We just went through them via diagram, but just to make it a little bit more clear, if they persecute others, they're firmly resettled. They've previously been denied asylum, and again, Megan and who else? I missed it. Someone else will be going through our screening process. Previously been denied by the immigration judge, IJ, or BIA, the Board of Immigration Appeals. They failed to apply within 1 year of arrival here. They've been convicted of an aggravated felony or a particularly serious crime. They're a danger to the security of the United States. They've committed a serious non-political crime, and or they have committed terrorist activities or material support of terrorism. They are barred from an asylum claim. And then here are alternative forms of relief if they're not eligible for asylum. And the benefits are not as free as or as freeing as the others for an asylum benefits, but there are other ways by which people can seek, can seek to stay. If, for example, they file after 1 year, these are the different forms of relief. All right, so we're going into the essential elements of proving an asylum claim. And I'm just going to go through them quickly. It's a credible testimony alone can be sufficient so that the person sitting in the room, and that's what you all will be working with primarily, the person sitting in the room talking to the lawyer, the advocate, talking to the intake person or the volunteer, and that you are interpreting, their testimony is sufficient enough to establish an asylum claim. But of course, we'll couple it with evidence, other evidence. All reasonable, available corroborating evidence. So that means we have to have memos, affidavits, we have to have their applications in. All of that has to be coupled with their testimony, and it has to be available. Things like birth certificates are very difficult to get in some other countries when you're not there. Police reports, getting things certified, so all that is part of the process. Burden of proof on the advocate must prove all issues. And so that's our job, to make sure we prove all of the issues. Here's an overview of the U.S. immigration system. If you can, I don't know if you can make it out in your materials because I know it's very tiny, but there are multiple branches of the U.S. immigration system and it's a little complex. And our clients sometimes get it confused, and I like to refer them to this because I'm a visual learner. But we start, of course, with the federal government, the executive branch, and we move down to our two branches, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. For the Department of Justice, we move down to the different branches. The ones that I think get most confused are the Department of Homeland Security. There are three branches here: the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the USCIS, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE, and you'll often hear that referred to with clients, and then the Customs and Border Protection, the CBP, and most people who have been apprehended experience them at the beginning of their process if they are an asylee. Okay, so there's a difference between affirmative asylum claims and defensive asylum claims. Affirmative asylum claims take place because the person has decided themselves within their own volition to file an asylum claim. So they start the process. There are no judicial proceedings against them. The government hasn't decided to bring a case against them and their stay here in the United States. It takes place because there have been no proceedings. And so you see how the process goes. First, we apply with the USCIS, and we apply usually their application of their asylum form, which for you would take a lot of sitting, listening to their story. We're going to break down sub-questions of some very uncomfortable situations, but situations that we need definitions, we need details for. We move on to biometrics, where they get fingerprinting, they get photo identification done with the government, they have an interview date set, and then they have an interview date with the asylum officer based on the application that we do with the USCIS. They'd want to confirm and make sure that they are indeed who they say they are, but also get an understanding of why it is that they should stay and remain in the United States. Then they'll have an outcome from the asylum officer, and if the asylum officer grants them stay, it's a wonderful, wonderful occasion. But if they don't, relief is not just obsolete, it's not terminated. They can still, they're referred to the immigration judge who then tries their case. And that's an affirmative asylum process. The defensive, however, is one where the judicial proceedings have already begun. So this is more like a court-like hearing. Most of the time, someone has been apprehended by border control, or they've been apprehended by some other form of government, and then they're giving a master and calendar hearing with the immigration judge. And the judge grants them time to prepare an application. That's when they'll come to see us. They'll come to the court. So it's more defensive, hence defensive asylum. Sometimes in defensive asylum, these people are sometimes detained if they're not children, but there's a difference between affirmative and defensive. So far, I think a lot of our clients, we get a little bit of both in both cases. Okay, so during the asylum process, just to get an understanding of what our clients are going through, they're legally allowed to stay. Don't let anyone tell you different, given the different political changes we've experienced. Legally allowed to stay. But they don't have formal legal status. So they can potentially be detained or subjected for monitoring by ICE when in removal proceedings, but they are allowed to stay in the United States while their process is being processed or their proceedings are taking place. Eligibility to work, they must have an asylum application pending for 180 days. So in the beginning of the chart, you saw that we apply or we send an application to the USCIS. It's submitted. Great. They have 180 days after it's pending. They then can apply, they then can begin to work. Within the 150 days of it pending, they have to apply to be able to work. And it takes about 30 days to process, so that hence the 180 days. You can only work if you have a work permit. So the first application is free, and then subsequent renewals require a fee. But again, that's work for the advocates, just to get you understanding. And then we refer most of our clients, depending on their emotional, mental, or physical needs, to social service referrals. Here are where our clients come from all over the world. We have a lot of people coming into our office. And so, as you can see, we need more than just, we need more than just people who can just speak English. We need people like you all who have perfected, your other languages and who can assist us in translating their stories, understanding where they're coming from. It's important that we get these details, and so you'll see these different countries. I know you all are capable of the languages that you speak and that you're helping us with, but if you see these countries and you know anyone who can speak the native languages of any of these countries, please feel free to reach out to us and refer them to us, because again, they mean the world of a difference to someone who really wants to live a healthy, wholesome, and protected, secure life here. Again, we refer all of our clients as they need to different services. Asylum claims are not the only things these people are going through. They need health care, they need food, transportation, housing. Again, I work with unaccompanied minors, and some of them do have families here and some of them don't. And so people really need these resources, and so these are our challenges for asylum seekers. Again, we're doing our best to make sure we refer our clients and we make sure they have a whole life here in the United States. Okay. If you all have any questions about what we do, of course I'm going to provide my email at the end. But we have a really informative website full of articles, press releases, just stories about what it is we do in asylum claims specifically. And you can go to our website. It's theadvocatesforhumanrights.org. Excuse me. And then we also have a library here full of pro bono materials. Again, I've listed some of them in the back. You won't be expected to read any of this case law or these regulations, but in case you're interested, they are made available to you. So here's my information, and you all can feel free to write that down or contact me. Do you have any questions?
Family reunification?
I'm sorry, could you speak up? Sorry.
For family reunification?
Yes.
You said you work with kids, so is it children get to reunite with their parents and their siblings, or is it only if your spouse and children?
Right now, it's interesting, and policy is always changing. But with the children that I work with sometimes have a family they're already here, but they're undocumented. And so with that, sometimes what we'll do, if we have capacity, we'll try our best to see what we can do for the adult parents who want to seek asylum. But of course, we have to make sure that they're not barred. And so there are a lot of elements we have to look at. But right now, I think the strongest cases that we have are for adults who are seeking to have their spouses and their children. It's very rare that children can often seek to have their parents come to the United States that way. And if they're there already, there may be a stronger claim. Thank you. Any other questions for me today? Okay, again, please feel free to email me. I'm cgore@advrights.org. And thank you all so much for your time. I can't emphasize this enough, but you translating, it can be incredibly frustrating when you're trying to tell your story, something that's so hard, and you really just want to stay here. You really just want to be safe. And you all are helping them tell their story to the asylum officer and the judge. We really appreciate you. So we hope that we'll see you in our offices. Thank you. Oh, sure. Oh, sure. You need me to read something for you?
Before we start, hi, I'm Graciela Gonzalez. I'm a criminal defense and immigration solo practitioner. And my contact information is there. Before going to law school rather late in life, I worked for many years as a court interpreter, both in the federal and state courts and in immigration court. And I teach a class at the University of Minnesota called Interpreting in Legal Settings. They have an interpreting and translation program through the College of Continuing Education. And I'm so proud that so many of my former students are certified court interpreters interpreting for my clients. So if anybody's interested, contact me and I'll send you information about it. Before we start, and by the way, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing what you're going to be doing or do already. Before we start, let me give you just a couple of little exercises.
Okay. One?
Yeah, why don't you start with number 3? That's
Okay.
the easiest. And I'm going to just call on any of you. They told me I couldn't walk around because it's being recorded. I'm going to call on any of you to repeat what Courtney just read. Okay, so pay attention.
Uh-oh. Okay. The suspect is described as smelling like cigarettes and grease. He also has an eagle tattooed on his right lower arm. He was wearing a white t-shirt, dark blue jeans, and a large belt buckle. He also wore a pair of tan leather or suede gloves.
Anybody? Come on. Anybody could just at least get, going. Start.
He smelled of cigarettes and grease.
Good. That's pretty good.
He had a tattoo of bald eagle on his right lower arm.
Very good.
He's wearing a white t-shirt and something pants. Jeez, I don't know.
Let's do one or two more. Why don't we break this down, the first sentence, and then start the second one?
Sure.
So this one is very short, so you should be able to repeat it.
Okay. Only the immigration judge may terminate removal proceedings upon request by either party.
No,
The case law C matter of GNC 22-1 December 281, the Board of Immigration Appeals 1988.
Anybody?
Only the immigration judge can repeal something.
Okay, the last sentence.
Sure. Furthermore, in this instance, the government will not be prejudiced by the granting of this motion to terminate removal proceedings, as it is not prohibited from instituting removal proceedings against Mr. Perez Garcia should it be justified at any time before or after admission. Come on, Gail.
Anybody?
I did mine.
Okay, let's do a last one.
Sure.
Number 1.
Okay.
And then I'll tell you the purpose of this exercise.
Sure. At 7:15 p.m. or so, a blue SUV, maybe a Ford, southbound, approached the intersection of 35th Avenue Northeast and North 27th. There was a stop sign, I think, but the driver did not stop. Then she turned left and took off like a bat out of hell. I could have just made out her license plate. I believe it was WKH 392, but I couldn't swear to it.
Okay. You know why I gave you this exercise? What would have helped you remember what was just said? Anybody?
Break it up.
That's one way. What else?
Take notes.
Okay, then let's get into my presentation and you will know. There's purpose to my madness. Let's start with that terminology. Translation means conveying written text into written text. Interpretation is oral. And you do have a copy of the PowerPoint. And I'm going to breeze through some of these slides. So be sure and take a look at the rest because there's some useful materials there. I'm bilingual, therefore I can interpret or translate. Right? Of course not, but it's a craft and you can learn it. You need two things. One, you have to be bilingual. I cannot do that for you. You have to be bilingual. Two, you have to practice because remember what mom told you, practice makes perfect, or at least makes it pretty good. And that's a photo that I took at the airport in Havana some years ago when I went with a group of people, and the English-speaking people were wondering, what am I supposed to do? Stand on my suitcase? How do I climb on my suitcase? Of course, I'm bilingual, so I knew what people were supposed to do. You were supposed to claim your luggage. And one of the problem is that, that's a funny little mistake. But sometimes the mistakes can be very costly. Any law student can tell you they have read this case in law school when they took contract law. And this is a wonderful, quote, because the judge who wrote the opinion said, well, the issue here is what is chicken, really? This was a lawsuit between an European company that signed a contract to buy huge quantities of chicken, frozen chicken, and what they got was not what they expected. So the judge wrote, this nicely illustrates that the making of a contract depends not on the parties having meant the same thing, but on the parties having said the same thing. And that's where you come in. And that's where your mistakes can be very costly for someone. Because, they thought they were buying chicken. Well, sometimes the translation for each one of these terms is very important. In the making of that contract obviously was, and it was overlooked. Actually, the plaintiff said in their lawsuit that they had been sent foul. The role of the interpreter or the translator is mainly a conduit for language communication. And what you do is you help the non-English speaking person to be meaningfully present. That means understanding what's happening to them, what's going on. So try to avoid expressing opinions and intervening or even advocating. You will be working in a more informal setting with the lawyers, so you have a more leeway. But it drives me and most lawyers crazy when there is a back and forth conversation between my client and the interpreter, and I have no idea what's being said. So we're going to talk about how to do it professionally. I just love this quote because, and this is more for the court interpreters. They're totally immersed in the system and totally aloof. They cannot be seen as advocating for anybody because we have an adversarial system of justice here. And so they cannot help one side or the other, or they cannot be seen as helping one side or another. And sometimes interpreter mistakes do help one side or another. And it's very disturbing when that happens. This is from a book that's rather old, but it's really very, very good. This is the goal. And the Minnesota Supreme Court picked up the language that's in bold letters at the bottom for the Code of Professional Responsibility for interpreters in the legal system here. And so the goal is to render a legal equivalence. And she defines it not as translating word by word, because it doesn't mean anything. Creates confusion. But coming up with a phrase that reflects what was said. For example, today I'm wearing black shoes. I'm Spanish speaking. If I were to say a literal translation of my black shoes, I would say, I'm wearing shoes blacks. And that is very confusing. Also, for example, in Spanish, in English, I'm cold, I'm hot, I'm hungry. In Spanish, I have heat. I have cold. I have hunger. Because my poor son, when he was 6 years old in Argentina, we had just arrived, and it was February, which is the peak of summer there, and he tells all his family, cousins, aunts, uncles, literally, I'm so hot. Everybody's falling down laughing because he had announced to the world that he was in heat. So, horny, 6 years old. He still remembers that. Now he can laugh at it. But so don't go for the literal translation. You have to know how to come up with the legal equivalence. That's what legal equivalence means. I'm going to spend a little time on 2 slides. A professional interpreter. I don't mean someone who gets paid for doing the work, although it's nice, but it's someone who acts professionally, is proficient and properly prepared. How do you prepare? Tell the lawyers, Can you give me some information about the case? Show up early, half an hour early, and pick up, ask them to give you some of the materials to prepare, to become familiar with what's going to be interpreted. It's really useful. It's punctual and dependable. Even though you're volunteers, if you accept an assignment, please show up. I was the pro bono attorney for the detained calendar in immigration court rather recently, and I was asked to talk to someone who had been interviewed the week before, but he had more questions. And this man was from some Asian country. And so they told me there was going to be an interpreter there at 8:30. I was there at 8:15. The interpreter never showed up or called. And so I did my best to try to talk to this man. I couldn't understand the word of what he said, and he had no idea what I was saying. It was so frustrating. So if you accept an assignment, show up. And if something comes up, let them know, so maybe they can find someone. This is important. Have a talk right at the beginning with the attorney, because you'll have to educate the attorneys too, because many of them have no clue as to how to communicate through your services. And so explain your role and explain it to the client. Put the client at ease. Tell them, I'm here because the attorney wants to make sure that you understand each other. Everything that's said here is confidential. And if you don't understand anything I say, please let us know immediately. And then the attorney will explain it to you. And I am going to be your voice in English and the attorney's voice in your language. So please, you have to speak to each other. I'm going to interpret in the first person. So it's so important, because if you say, tell her this or tell him that, or she said this, it's terrible. Now, there's a horrible drawback to doing it in the first person. And that is, it's one thing to say, oh, the soldiers came to the house and did this and this and this to her or to him. It's very different when you say, the soldiers came to the house and they did this and this and that to me. For some reason, you internalize it, and you will leave some of those assignments. Even your hair will ache from the tension of, saying those things. However, remember, you have to be detached. If you realize that a few minutes ago you made a mistake, just say, oh, I need to make a correction for something I said, but only if it's important and if it was a major distortion. Otherwise, forget it. Keep on going. Don't second guess yourself. One of the mistakes that interpreters make when they're starting, they provide several options. If you commit to a word or a phrase, stick with it. Because otherwise, if you start second guessing yourself and offering more and more, you confuse everybody. And that comes with practice. Now you see why I have that photo there and why I gave you the exercise earlier. Take notes. You cannot possibly remember everything that's being said. So take notes. Don't write the whole thing, but you may need to take down numbers, addresses, phone numbers, dates, the time, names, things like that. And as and every person develops their own shorthand system. So ask politely for repetition or clarification. However, this is the way it should be done. If the client said something and you need clarification or repetition, you tell the lawyer, I need to ask your client to clarify a term he's using. And then you ask the person, could you please clarify what you mean when you said this? Same thing with the attorney. Don't leave one of the parties out, because it's very distressing when people are talking back and forth and you have no idea what's being said. So you tell the client, oh, I need to ask your attorney to clarify something for me. And then you do what you need to do. Try not to explain anything. Just tell, the client, oh, I need to ask your attorney to explain something. And you just ask the attorney, I don't have a good translation for what you just said. Could you explain it? No one will get upset. Disclose any conflict of interest, real or apparent. Fatigue, that's going to be your number one enemy. As soon as you start getting tired, you start making more and more and more mistakes. And you will see the signs as you do it more often. So be sure and ask them to give you a break. Tell them, sorry, your interpreter is getting tired. Could I please have 15, 20 minutes? Go have some coffee, water, go to the bathroom, take a walk, whatever. Never carry on a conversation back and forth without informing the other party what's being said. Confidentiality, it goes without saying, but you have to tell the client everything is going to remain confidential. Try to keep your emotions in check. And it's very difficult sometimes. If someone breaks down and starts crying, you just want to hug them and say, oh, please, please don't. But you add to their trauma if you start crying. So try to be detached and be aware of vicarious trauma. They're going to send you by email an article that I shared on a few, tricks that you can use to deal with that vicarious trauma. Like after the assignment, have a glass of wine, go for a run, see a movie, whatever. But you have to learn to recognize the signs and deal with it, because otherwise it's very stressful. Culture and language. If you speak a language that there is a very small, tight-knit community, it's very difficult sometimes for people to be forthcoming with information, personal information, with someone from their own small group. So you have to be aware of that. Gender issues is the other thing. In some cultures, women are not comfortable talking to men and vice versa. Beware of clinging clients. Never give them your phone number or email address or your home address, because I promise you someone will show up at your door, because they know you understand them. They can communicate with you, so they can become very dependent. So remember, you have to be aloof and detached for your own protection and your family. Visit that website when you have a chance and read the 10 canons that the Supreme Court came up for for interpreters, because they will give you some really good ideas. And here's another slide where I want to spend a little time. This first one, this is the Minnesota Court Interpreters Program. Go there, and then they have an option to click that says for interpreters. You have glossaries, legal glossaries in several languages. So it will help you develop your own. They have court forms in English and in several languages. The next ones are all in English, but remember, you cannot interpret what you don't understand. If you take one lesson from me, it should be that one. First, you have to understand what the person is saying, and then you can come up with a translation or interpretation. And also remember that not every good interpreter is a good translator, or a good translator is capable of interpreting. Some people are totally illiterate, they can't read, and they're great interpreters. So you will have to learn your limitations. Also, USCIS has a good glossary, but these are only in English. And the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department. So visit those websites and do take a look at those glossaries. They're very useful. And here is the process that's going on, and it's amazing. If you read, it's been researched really well. Modes of interpretation. In court, they use mostly simultaneous, with headphones now in immigration court. If you go to immigration court, you'll see the interpreter far away from the client. And I feel sorry for the clients because sometimes they can't even, they're afraid to say they didn't understand or whatever. So I prepare my clients to work with interpreters, but not every lawyer does that. And I can take a look at their face and know they're not understanding. Consecutive interpretation is what you're going to do mostly. Those little exercises at the beginning, remember the notebook? When I go for a USCIS interview with a client and I have hired an interpreter, I always bring a pad and some pens for the interpreter, and I ask them to be sure and take notes. And then side translation. Relay interpretation is when you go from language A to B to C. And I can't imagine how much the communication is distorted when that happens, but sometimes we don't have a choice. Some of our Central American clients speak native languages, and they hardly speak or understand Spanish, so we have to use some of those native interpreters who interpret into Spanish, not into English. And, simultaneous, I'm not going to spend much time because you will not be doing much of it. Consecutive. Why do I say that here is where you have the highest danger of making harmful errors? This is especially for the court interpreters, but also for your role too, because you're putting words into someone's mouth. And what you are saying, that they are saying, is going to make a big difference in the understanding that the attorneys have of the situation, the story, how they write the client's story, but also in court, because the jury is hearing what the interpreter is saying, and what they hear is what's going to make a big difference in their decision. So the goal has to be conservation of meaning and coming up with a legal equivalence, but also you have to control the flow, the rate of the speech. For example, at the beginning, tell the client, if you start going too fast, too far, too long, I always used to tell them when I interpreted, you can tell your whole story, but please do so in small segments, break it up, so that I don't forget anything. And please, if you start going too long, I'm going to just, have a little gesture. If you see me doing this, that means please stop, let me interpret. And tell the lawyers too. If your question gets too long, I may do this. That means please stop, break it down, whatever. So reassure them that they can tell the whole story, but in small segments, because you want to make sure that everybody can hear what they have to say. And here's a few strategies. Practice active listening. That means listening for words in context, because the context will tell you what the best translation is for a lot of things. Remember, pay attention to fatigue. That's your worst enemy. I cannot tell you. When I used to interpret for trials that last all day, but we were alternating, there was always a team of two, I could realize that I was getting tired when I became dyslexic. If you, set a phone number, I would write it down, 612, and I'm reading and I would say 621 or something like that, totally reversing what I had just written. That was a sign for me that I was getting tired, so I always say so. Please, I need a break. I'm getting very tired. Some lawyers are aware of this. Others are not. Also, pay attention to the context. And if you don't understand it, ask for clarification. I was walking down the path and I came upon a greenhouse. Are we talking about a house painted green or a structure where you grow plants? In Spanish, we have two different words for that. Site translation. You will be asked to do this very often. Someone will come and will give you a document. A lawyer will say, oh, my client wrote this down. Could you please read it to me in English? No. I mean, you can, but this is what you should do. I'm going to need a few minutes to review the document before I can do it. Is that okay? And then you read the entire document, understand it, make sure you make sense of it. When you're doing the site translation, you should be glancing ahead a little bit to see what comes next, but never grab the document and start site translating. Do get anything and record yourselves doing site translation. You will cringe because you're going to sound like you're back in first grade when you were learning to read. It really, takes time to get used to doing this. And if they give you a legal document, you may have to look up some words. Now, this is a wonderful quote, that it should be like sight reading music. Well, you don't learn to sight read music in a day. Same thing with sight translation. Because the goal is conservation of meaning and trying to keep the register. However, how do you convey orally words that are misspelled, wrong grammar? I mean, some people will give you something that's handwritten and it doesn't have a comma or anything, no punctuation. So you have to start adding pauses here and there and understand that before you can sight translate it. Challenging assignments. Lawyers can be so difficult. These are phrases that I took down when I was interpreting for trials. The last one is my favorite. I'm not kidding. I'm simultaneously interpreting for a defense lawyer, cross-examining an expert witness, a chemist. You testified before, did you know, doctor, that it is not infrequent not to find great traces of? And then the client says yes or no. What was the answer to what? Thank goodness the judge was a former high school English teacher. And she said my eyes started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So she stopped him dead in his tracks and she said, counsel, there's too many double negatives there. Rephrase your question. Please make them direct and shorter. But sometimes no one else is paying attention, so don't let them get away with that. Do you tell the lawyer, oh, I'm sorry, I need you to rephrase that, break it down, because I'm not really sure how to interpret that. Pay attention to pauses. I'm hungry, let's eat. Grandma. Or, like lawyers say, I rest my case. Active listening. Listen for the pauses. Make sure that you understand what's being said. I love this quote. The defense would contend that the conduct of the plaintiff has vitiated the performance obligation of the defendant in the instant case. Do you know what they're saying? How can you be expected to interpret that? This is the author's translation into real English. It's from a very old issue of the Journal of the American Bar Association. He was making fun of attorneys who come up with these pompous words. Don't let the lawyers get away with this. Right at the beginning, you tell them, if you're going to use any acronym, please define it. So I tell my clients, if you hear someone say ice, we're not talking about frozen water. We're talking about the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so then you can just tell the client, well, When I say, the NTA, well, it's the notice to appear. And then you can say the NTA or whatever you want to say, or the IJ, that's the immigration judge. But it has to be defined because you cannot possibly know what all this means or be expected to know. Dialects. Have a brief visit with the client to make sure you understand each other. Ask them what they're from. If you speak Spanish, Latin American Spanish changes from country to country, and words that are perfectly acceptable in one country are obscenities in others. And so have a brief conversation, because remember, this is your lesson. You cannot interpret or translate what you don't understand. What are we talking about here? Okay? Again, I'll rest my case. Dialects are important and you have to be aware of them. You are going to be a bridge between systems that have no equivalent. Some clients have had little or no education, so if the lawyer gets going with this lots of legalese, remind them, oh, please, it's okay in the informal setting. You cannot do that in court. You have so much power because you're the only person who understands everybody. And look at the second bullet point. One simple preposition can make a huge difference. In a criminal case, if the dope was on the dresser, that's admissible evidence, but it was in the dresser and the search warrant did not authorize the cops to open the dresser, that's an illegal search. And what's in bold letters is coarse, but it illustrates what I mean. Pay attention to the prepositions. It's the last thing you will learn when you learn a new language, and it's the first thing you lose from your own language. Pay attention to how things are said. Register. You will have to say very uncomfortable things. And I tell my students, and you will get paid good money for saying all the things that your mom never let you say when she was around. So don't make a production. Some people start sanitizing the language and getting all flustered. Don't call attention to yourself. Slips of the ear. If you are not a native speaker of English, you will know what I mean, that sometimes we don't hear the difference between the short and the long E sound, or whatever. Gina, could you please read the second bullet point?
Is man.
Oh, come here. It has to be. So, see if you know exactly, can tell the difference.
The diseased man suffered from a terminal disease. The deceased man did not have a will. Since the decedent died interstate and had no heirs but had only a few hairs, his estate will escheat to the state.
Okay? If you are not a native speaker of English, sometimes you could have a hard time hearing the difference between those words. A sheet, by the way, means that if a person dies without a will and has no heirs, all his possessions will go to the state. That's what it means. See, don't let people throw legalese at you without clarifying it. Children can be a nightmare because they mix the languages. And then when it comes to body parts, no family uses the same language as the person next door. So you have to really clarify, put them at ease, earn their trust slowly. But remember, you have to also to be aloof. Follow the rule of 3 whenever you can. That means you speak with the client only when there is an English-speaking person present and speaking to the client. Otherwise, when the interview is done, and the attorney picks up all the papers and gets up, you do the same. Walk out with them. Don't sit there, because remember, some of them can become very clinging because they understand you and they trust you. English is hard, isn't it? How many people we have here who are not native speakers of English? So you know what I'm talking about. The insurance was invalid for the invalid. Same word. I mean, there was a row among the oarsmen about how to row. And I love this one. When shot at, the dove dove into the bushes. So, and now, same word. So many possible translations. So, active listening, consider what's being said in context. Let's do quickly, watch a video that will illustrate some situations that you could encounter and how to deal with them. Just replace therapist with
attorney.
attorney.
In Britain, whose first language is not English, is growing. What's the impact of this for organisations which provide mental health interventions and support? We know that to meet our clients where they are, we need to be able to speak a common language. And where possible, it may be advantageous to have access to buy and trialling your clinicians so that clients can express themselves directly in their own languages. However, with the growing range of language needs, this isn't always possible. Traditionally, clinical work and psychotherapy is conducted between two people, and the idea of incorporating a third person into the therapeutic relationship can be unsettling. We've listened to therapists and interpreters who've described situations when they've had no training in working together. They've expressed concerns and anxieties about the thought of working together or experiences they've already had. Scenarios which motivated us to make this training DVD have been incorporated into this resource.
I want you to know that whatever you say in this session is confidential.
من میخوام شما بدونید که هر چی که در این جلسه گفته میشه کاملا محرمانه است.
شما چی فکر میکنی؟ میتونم بهش اعتماد کنم؟
What do you think?
نمیشه با خودتون حرف بزنم؟ من به شما اطمینان دارم.
What do you think? Can I trust him? Can't I just talk to you? I trust you.
Of course you can trust me.
البته که میتونی به من اطمینان کنی.
چرا رفتی حرف منو به این زدی؟
This is the end of the session, and as agreed, we will meet next week at 2 p.m.
این آخر جلسمونه. همونجور که با هم قرار گذاشتیم هفته دیگه ساعت 2 میبینیم هم دیگه رو.
خداحافظ.
بای.
Goodbye.
خب الان که این رفته میشه یه چیز خیلی مهم بهتون بگم؟
Remember the rule of three?
Hello, I'm Ben the counselor. Are you Maya?
Yes, this is Maya, and I'm Andy interpreter.
First person.
E eu não sei porque é que estou aqui. Assistente social disse para eu vir, eu vim.
She doesn't really know why she's here. It was the social worker told her to come, and she came. But I don't think the social worker is all that good. She doesn't really understand Maya's needs, and really, particularly in our culture, people find it really hard to talk about their problems in public. So.
Could you please stop looking at the interpreter? You need to look at me.
Por favor, deixe de olhar para a intérprete. Precisa de olhar para mim.
Desculpe, eu não tenho intenção de ofender.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do anything wrong.
That's why you need to have that talk right at the beginning. Explain how things are done.
So how are you feeling this week?
ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਹਫਤੇ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਰਹੇ?
मैं कमजोर महसूस करती है मैं ज़्यादा खाता नहीं है
I'm feeling really weak and I haven't eaten much. It's Ramadan this week and she probably hasn't been eating because of that.
Oh, I see.
It's best not to. I mean, the lawyer should follow up with a good question there.
Can you tell me how you heard your parents had died?
ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੱਸ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਮਾਂ-ਬਾਪ ਦੀ ਮੌਤ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ? ਕੋਈ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਮਦਦ ਲਈ ਆ ਇੱਥੇ ਫਿਕਰ ਨਾ ਕਰੋ ਤੁਸੀਂ.
What's she doing? Can you please be quiet?
This is how not to do it. Both sides. You want to hug them, but that's not your role. Be respectful, quiet, but you're not there to comfort them. You're there to help them tell their story.
Where would you like to start?
Od czego chce pan zacząć?
No od tego, że to jest tak, że właściciel cały czas, właściciel mojego mieszkania wysyła mi listy z pogróżkami. Moja żona mówi, żebym je ignorował w ogóle, żebym nawet ich nie czytał, tak? I ona ma to gdzieś i mówi, żebym się nie przejmował, a ja nie mogę tak po prostu, jej cały czas nie ma w domu, ja dostaję te listy, nawet jak wychodzę, to po prostu obrzuca mnie jakimiś uwagami, naprawdę mi grozi.
Proszę pan się zatrzymać, nie jestem w stanie przetłumaczyć wszystkiego dla terapeuty.
No dobrze, no ale to jest poważny problem dla mnie, tak? I gdyby pani mogła, bardzo proszę, tak? Dlaczego mi pani przerywa? To jest w ogóle...
So, having the talk at the beginning will avoid all this. We're almost done here.
How has it been for you this week?
Jak wszystko się układało dla pana w tym tygodniu?
No jeszcze gorzej, nawet nie mogłem wyjść z domu.
It was even worse. I wasn't able to get out of my house this week, and it was a serious problem.
Are you okay? What? Is there something wrong?
You see, my mother has the same problem, and we are worried about her so much.
No one is interested in your story, sorry. Honestly, you're not the star of the show. If it affects you emotionally, try to keep it under wraps. And, okay, we're done with this. Then let's go to the next slide. How do I want to go back.
You're going to have to do it with the mouse.
Oh, okay. Okay, let's go to the next slide now. Questions? We have a few minutes, so we can go over what we just saw, did, heard. Sorry, I kind of rushed through it, but there's a lot. Any questions? Okay, since you don't have any questions, I'm going to ask a few. What lessons did you take from the video we just saw? Anybody? Come on. Yes, please.
Not involve your personal experience in the interpreting.
Okay, speak up so everybody can hear you.
Do not involve your personal experience when interpreting.
Good. What else? Anybody? Yes.
Understand your goal as to communicate and not give opinions.
Good. Anybody else? Yes.
That it's really important to set the parameters and expectations of your role before the conversation starts.
right at the beginning. Very good. You set the parameters right at the beginning. You explain your role. You explain to people how things are done. Remember, I'm going to be your voice in English, the attorney's voice in your language. So you just speak directly to each other. And then tell them everything that's said here, I have to interpret. So I used to tell people when I was an interpreter, so if you don't want the judge to hear what you're saying, then you can't say it to me. Because if you say it, I'll interpret it. And yeah. Speak up.
Don't carry on a conversation without informing the third party.
Very good. Avoid having a lengthy conversation with the client. Also, the rule of 3 will protect you and the client and the whole process. When the attorney gets up, you get up too. Okay? Don't sit there alone. At the beginning, it's okay to have a little conversation. I was in a federal court once for an initial hearing where they had several defendants at the same time, and they had some Spanish speakers. I had the equipment so I could do the simultaneous interpretation, and there was an interpreter from India, and there were 3 people there. And he comes and asks me, what kind of a conference is this? Remember what I told you, preparation. You have to ask ahead of time what this is about, what I'm going to be reading. What I do when I hire an interpreter to go to USCIS with me, I email them the blank form that is going to be, you know, what the officers are going to go through, like if it's an application for an immigrant visa or whatever, or naturalization or an asylum application. So the interpreter will have that information, because those questions are written by lawyers, and some of them are so ridiculous and so convoluted, very, very difficult. I mean, one of my favorite is, have you ever committed a crime involving moral turpitude for which you were not arrested? First of all, you know, moral turpitude, and also, I mean, it's sometimes I have a hard time not laughing when they ask that question, because my instinct tells me, oh, yeah, and if I had, I would tell you if they didn't catch me, please. But some of the questions are very difficult, the way they're worded. I had a client who was very young and asked me what the Nazi party was. Or, you know, she had never heard of it. So it's good to have that ahead of time. Also, you know, it's so important to explain to people how, not only what your role is, but how you do it. Any other questions? Anything else that you took from there? Yes?
Do you have a copy of the presentation?
I can send it out.
You do? Oh. Yeah. And do visit those websites I suggested, because you will find really useful materials. And again, thank you, thank you, thank you for doing what you do. We couldn't do it without you. So give yourselves a hand. Okay? And I hope this was useful.
Oh, yes. Take care of yourselves. So you'll have to email it to them. That'd be great. Yeah, do you mind?
No, we will definitely do that.
And also the article about the vicarious trauma. It's really useful. This is from a journal of psychology. It's short, but very, very useful.
Perfect. Thank you all for coming out today and talking with us and helping us help you in our mission. My name is Megan McKinney. I'm one of the program assistants at the Advocates for Human Rights, and I work in the Refugee and Immigrant Program. And so I'm just going to go through some of the intake process with you and let you know of different opportunities in which we will call upon you and your bilingual or multilingual skills. And so the way our intake process works is we get into contact with a potential client. So somebody either calls us or we might screen an individual at court and they say, I am afraid to go back to my country. And so we will call them, either staff members, so myself as a program assistant, or some of our interns, a couple of which are here today, will call the individual and perform a basic phone screening. And these are usually about 30 minutes to 40 minutes. And we'll try to get the basics of contact information, income information, what language they speak, what languages they may speak, if they have any English proficiency or not, and then just the basics of their asylum claim. And then once we have that, and we believe that they have a viable claim in which we may be able to help, we'll bring them in for a full intake interview. And so this is usually between 1 hour and 2 hours, and it's just a chance for us to delve deeper into their stories and to hear more about why they're afraid to go back to their country, to ask questions that they may be asked in the future at the asylum office or in immigration court when they submit their full asylum application. And following the intake interview, the attorneys in our office will deliberate and decide if we'll be able to take on the individual as a client or not. And hopefully we will be able to, which is super exciting. And so we'll send them the case acceptance materials and bring them in for a client responsibilities and basic needs meeting. And so this is just a chance for the attorneys in our office to meet the people with whom they'll be working and also to work through any issues they may be having. So if the individual has severe trauma and they are seeking psychological help for it, we can have some referrals available to them and hopefully help them work through whatever they need so that they're able to focus as much as possible upon their asylum case and upon this really long process. And so then we'll hopefully find a volunteer attorney that we can match our client to, and the volunteer attorney will work with the client through the entire asylum process and hopefully get that application in and eventually have the chance to get the client asylum if all goes well. And so there are a lot of steps in our process and there are a lot of places for y'all to enter into. And so our intake interviews are one of the big ones where these are long opportunities. They're often difficult in terms of just the content because these are really difficult stories. And so it's important that we're able to communicate with the individual as fully as possible so that we can have all of the facts of their story, so that we can make an informed decision. So we really need volunteers for the intake interviews. And then if we're able to take on the individual as a client, hopefully they'll be able to have interpreters help me with the attorneys so that the attorney and the client can understand each other and can help prepare the asylum case. And then we have a lot of documents, as happens with legal cases. And so an individual can come and help do some document translation, birth certificates, death certificates, different personal statements. And then eventually the individual will hopefully have an asylum interview with which we often need interpreters. And for those of you who speak Spanish, we also have the Minnesota Detention Project, where attorneys go out to the immigration court and meet with potential clients. And so that also provides an opportunity to plug in and help us be able to communicate with different individuals. And we also have a volunteer opportunity for those of you who speak Spanish. We run a national asylum helpline. It's run from 9 a.m. till 4 p.m. Central Standard Time, Monday through Friday. And we want to have that always be staffed so that individuals from all over the country can call our number and say, hey, I'm seeking asylum. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. I don't know what to do. Can I have help? And we can look up resources and hopefully give them information that they need so they can move forward with their process and be able to apply for asylum. And so that's a really great volunteer opportunity for those of you who speak Spanish and would really love to have an active role in our work. I think that's all I have, so I'm going to pass it back to Janath.
All right, thank you for that, Megan. So we're about to wrap up here. Lastly, I want to go over, after this great training about what you can do as a volunteer interpreter to us, the volunteer opportunities we have and the different stages in which you can volunteer for us, and the broader context of what the asylum process looks like. Now I'm just going to go over really quick, for those of you who haven't signed up to be a volunteer interpreter for us, how to do that and how to get involved. And yeah, for those of you who are already in the process, I also there might be some new steps that you might not be aware of, so I hope it's applicable to everybody. This is just easier for me. So the first step, I think most of you should be aware of, is going to our website. And the form to sign up to be a volunteer looks pretty similar to the registration one, but just in case, I'm going to walk everyone through it. So this is our website. You go to volunteer, you go to interpreters and translators. And then you go to volunteer interpreter sign up form, which if you haven't done and you only went up here and signed up for training, it's a few links down. Then again, it looks the same. You fill it out, you submit it, then the next step is that I will email you. So if you haven't received a confirmation from me, that means you still need to fill out this form, even if you think you've done it, just because a lot of our forms look the same. So just to make sure, you can fill out this form. And after you do, I will send you a confirmation email. It'll be a little welcome memo with instructions. Attached to it will be our training manual and interpretation basics. It's kind of things that Graciela covered today, but she covered a lot of things that are not in there, which is why we appreciate her. But that's your basics to read up that we recommend that everybody reads before they go into any interpretation setting, because those are our rules versus like Graciela's are kind of strategies. So make sure you read that. And then we have a confidentiality agreement, which if you were here at the beginning, I passed it out to the first couple rows. If you came in later, they should still be in the back. I'll email that out again, and you can fill it out online or scan it or mail it, email it, however you want. You have to get that back to me. And the reason I brought it today is just because if some of you have already been interpreting for a while and we don't have that document on file, you can just go ahead and sign it today and give it to me, and then we're ready to go as far as that, having the paperwork, and then you don't have to email it later. And after that, you should be all set. After I get the documentation of your confidentiality agreement, you're signed up as a volunteer, and you'll start receiving emails from me with opportunities, and they might be at different stages, like Megan told us about. Some of them are intake interviews, sometimes where they'll be in our office, and other times you're going directly to an attorney's office to interpret for a client who's already been matched. So I'll usually include, the date, time, and location of an appointment if we have that information available. Sometimes attorneys are very open to your availability, so in that case, I could write that down. So most of our opportunities will send out an email. There's various staff who send out emails, so just look for anything from ADV Rights. And if you can't go to this, if you can't do it, there's no need to respond. But if you do, we'll get back to you, and that's usually a commitment. And we expect you to be there. So the most important thing is that you communicate with your attorneys and meet all our deadlines as we've expressed kind of with the process. Like, these are really important deadlines for our clients. So if you can't make an appointment or can't get a translation in time, just letting first the attorney know, and then us if we need to know as well so we can find another interpreter. And then lastly, we ask everyone who's done an interpretation to fill out a reporting form, which you can also find on the same website, same place on our website. So for current volunteers, we have a reporting form, in which case you just fill out that you did an interpretation or a translation for us, and that way we can record it as an in-kind donation, because the services you provide are, very professional services that count towards like the services that we don't have to pay for, and we can count that as part of like the in-kind donations we receive as an organization in order to provide more services for our clients. So if you can fill that out, I'll usually send out a reminder, maybe monthly, to fill that out every time you do an assignment. Let's see. I think that should. That's all. Yeah.
Could you go back to my first slide?
Yeah.
When you're done.
I can get back to it now. Yeah, if you have any more questions about volunteering with us, interpreting, I'm the person who does the logistics and the coordinating of matching you with attorneys, with our staff. So you can ask me, you can email me or call me. I'll hopefully be able to answer all your questions or direct them to the right person. And you wanted me to go back to your slide?
Contact information is in that first slide.
In the first slide?
If you want to take it down, it's fine.
Let me... We went through so much today. All right, and this is Graciella's contact again, if you want to write down her information as well, and we can get you everybody's contact information who spoke today if you would like. Yep. Courtney, did you have things in the back you wanted to advertise?
Sure. Do I have to see them?
No.
Okay.
I don't care.
We do have some events that are going on at the Advocates. Right now, we've been, along with the Friends of the St. Paul Library, hosting a film series. The last film that we have is taking place November 30th, if you're interested. It's called Don't Tell Anyone, and it's happening at the Highland Park Community Center on Wednesday, November 30th at 6:30, if you're interested. Materials are in the back about that. We also have a brochure. It's in Spanish right now, but I think we might have some more extra English copies. We might be gone now, about our work we do with advocates. If you have friends who want to translate or need more information, that's in the back, as well as the lengthy list of case law and regulations if you want to look through the asylum sources that we use.
Yeah, I think unless there's any other questions, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for coming out. I hope you'd like to volunteer with us. Thanks.